got there and began to look for the entrance. Nowhere to be seen. There were trams running up and down the road, tram tracks too, but no shaft. Ah, yes, the shaft, they said. You're going to build it. So we had to pull up all the tram tracks, build a fence around the site, and clear away all the stones with our metal spades. Then and only then did we actually start work on the metro itself.
We had our hands-on experience in the shafts. Shaft number 21 was a red gate. It was the deepest excavation there was. Materials were hoisted up and down in a cage. For the workforce and the miners, we all had to climb up and down by ladder. It was a wooden ladder which went right down through a deep well into the tunnel. As you climbed down, it got more iced over, more slippery. Little lamps flickered here and there in the gloom, and it was difficult to see where you were stepping next. It was so frightening, like going down into hell.
The first 7 miles of line were opened on the 15th of May 1935. Stalin congratulated its builders.
Благодарность ударникам и ударницам и всему коллективу инженеров, техников, рабочих и работниц метростроя.
We got so dirty, and we were such young things, small, slender, fragile. But we had our orders to build the metro, and we wanted to do it more than anything else. We wore our overalls with such chic, and those rubber hats. We set them on our heads cowboy style. And then there were the boots, huge boots. My feet were size 4, and the boots were 11s.
In Soviet Central Asia, Muslim tradition kept women veiled and at home. Saudat Shamshieva set out to liberate them.
All the women were asking, why are so many of us being victimized? Why not cast off our veils altogether, all on one day? So off they went, all threw off their veils, and that was the day the women in Samarkand set themselves free. Later on, they set up the Hujum factory, the silk-making factory in Samarkand. They eventually added a dressmaking workshop, and finally a factory, all sorts. But our first task was to explain to the women that if they didn't work, if they didn't earn their own money, they could never really be free.
Some men reacted violently to this assault on their holiest traditions. For burning to death a woman from his family who had thrown off her veil, this man was tried and executed. By 1930, the plan was well underway. But Stalin expected still more from the workers. He commanded them to complete the plan in 4 years, not 5. Targets were raised and then raised again. To encourage the workforce, stupendous feats of production were stage-managed by the party. This miner, Alexei Stakhanov, managed to cut 102 tons of coal in his shift. His quota was just 7 tons. He became a hero of socialist labor and gave his name to a movement, Stakhanovism.
Сегодня мы гордо рапортуем любимому вождю Иосифу Виссарионовичу, что шахта Центральная Ирмина вместо суточной добычи 900 тонн выдал на гора 1800 тонн. Наше слово мы выполнили с честью. Да здравствует великий вождь народа, наш родной товарищ Сталин. Ура!
Robert Robinson was working at the first state ball-bearing plant in Moscow when a comrade broke all production records.
He produced twice the amount in one night. The next day, he became a hero of the Soviet Union. He was given, just like Stakhanov, special privileges, among which was a 5-room apartment. Before, he and his family of 5 lived in a 2-room apartment. Now he was given 5. And within the next 3 months, he was promoted as the director of the 16,000 people in that factory. That's where I worked. All over the place, there were Stakhanovites working full speed because everybody wanted to have a piece of the pie.
The newsreels offered a vision of plenty, but the plan was not delivering the goods. Even the basic necessities of life were hard to find. Despite the promises, luxuries were unobtainable by all but the privileged. The workers' state demanded great sacrifices and imposed great hardships on the people in whose name it ruled. But the shelves remained stubbornly empty. The planned utopia had not been achieved. Scapegoats had to be found.
Politicians everywhere tend to shift the blame for failures and mistakes. During the 5-year plan, the Soviet leadership developed this on a grand scale. Their method was to mount a show trial of convenient scapegoats, a trial in which the evidence had nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with covering up the failures of the Soviet system. The Shakhty trial, here in Moscow's Hall of Columns, was the first great example, and Stalin pronounced himself well pleased with the results.
In 1928, 53 engineers working at the Shakhty coal mines were put on trial accused of sabotage and wrecking. The newspapers called for death to the wreckers. Even the 12-year-old son of one of the defendants demanded the death penalty. The judges obliged, and 5 of the accused were shot. The real explanation for wrecking incidents was often all too simple.
Even in midwinter, there were shipments arriving of very valuable equipment, and included among it was a shipment of drill rod, very expensive steel, and it was lying on the docks, exposed to the snow, and I don't know how many months it lay there as they were waiting for the building to finish. And some workers mistook the drill rod for concrete reinforcing rods, and hence it was used in the balance of the factory construction. And when the truth became known, there was a big public trial, and many Russians were arrested and sent off, I suppose some to long periods in Siberia, maybe some to their death.
British engineers were accused of running a network of saboteurs and spies.
Here we are, back again from Moscow.
It is positively absurd, ridiculous, to think that such men would go out to Russia, take time and care and patience to erect machinery, and then for them to turn round and wreck that machinery.
It's absurd. It's damned silly. Isn't that so, de Nordwell?
Of course it is, every word of it.
In 1930, another show trial opened. The defendants, engineers and other specialists, were accused of forming an opposition group, the Industrial Party. Their leader, Professor Ramzin, was accused by public prosecutor Vyshinsky of plotting treason with Lawrence of Arabia and French President Poincaré. The accused duly confessed their guilt.
Когда вся моя вина перед вами налицо, и я всецело передаю себя Пролетарскому суду Как он найдет, может вступить со мной.
Activists whipped up demonstrations demanding the death penalty. The daughter of Stalin's foreign minister took part.
We marched the streets with slogans, death to the traitor and all that, and were terribly worked up. Then the next day, there was another meeting, and they told us that the government has decided to commute the sentence, to pardon Ramzin. And I wept and wept and wept at that meeting because somehow, I wouldn't put it in those words, but I felt we'd been had. We didn't think in terms of Stalin, but just somehow that we were manipulated. Our feelings were.
The Moscow-Volga Canal. It is still an important transport artery for the Soviet Union. A monument to both human cruelty and human endurance, it was built by thousands of slave laborers, victims of the economic and social policies of Joseph Stalin. Pavel Panda, arrested in 1935 as a counter-revolutionary, was a member of this slave labor force.
Постепенно входило в наше сознание, что
Gradually, it dawned on us that our arrests were no accident. We hadn't been collected together because of the crimes we'd supposedly committed. The whole thing had been done with a purpose, to complete mammoth tasks in the cheapest possible way.
дешевым образом сделать такую большую работу. Именно что это огромное сооружение.
It meant that the construction of this huge canal was done by hand, using cheap labor. There was no mechanical equipment. It was just like building the pyramids.
Slave labor by prisoners was to be the backbone of the Soviet economy for the next 2 decades. The first canal was the Belomor, built to link the Baltic and the White Sea. Its 300,000 slave laborers were managed by convicted engineers. This propaganda film claimed that the laborers were all ordinary criminals. Corrective labor would make them useful citizens of the workers' state. The canal opened just 2 years after work began, and Stalin paid a visit. The corrective labor camps run by Genrikh Yagoda, head of the political police, became the Soviet Union's largest construction enterprise. Like the rest of the centrally planned economy, slave laborers had quotas to fulfill. But it wasn't wages they worked for.
Система на канале принуждения к труду.
The way they stopped people slacking on the canal was very simple and very effective. They didn't have to use force. Everything revolved around the fact that the more you worked, the more you got to eat. There were 3 incentives to make us work. The first was the basic bread ration, then there was a hot meal, and the third was the extra ration for really hard workers.
И третье – это ударный зачет. А вот уже к концу дня, когда уже смеркалось.
I remember how towards the end of the day, at dusk, the workers who couldn't fulfill their quota would trail home. They looked so pitiful, dragging their feet. You could tell at a glance they were goners.
Было ясно, что хорошим для них это не кончится.
They died by the hundreds of thousands and were buried in unmarked graves, like this one just 15 miles from the Kremlin. It was rediscovered in 1989. The sign warns that here lie the victims of Stalinism. They were only the first of millions.
The image of peasant and worker united is an enduring symbol of the Soviet Revolution. The Russian word for it is smychka, which suggests the closest of bonds.